We can all be thankful that your sanctuary is not heated by a single wood-burning stove right there in the middle aisle, because those of you on the far edges would be very cold this morning in an early pioneer church. One wood-burning stove in an early Adventist church. Well, I'm happy to be back on this first day of January. So we as Adventists can greet one another not only with Happy New Year, but with Happy Sabbath today as we turn the pages back and look how the Lord has led in our past history. We're wrapping up the 1870s this morning. Isn't that exciting? We started with 1849. So we're making rapid progress, and we hope that this evening we'll be able to begin the 1880s when the work rapidly expanded across Indiana. But because so many of you love going to camp meeting, I thought I would devote one section of our talk this morning to the camp meetings of the 19th century here in Indiana and elsewhere. They were quite different, quite different from the camp meeting you're accustomed to when you go to Cicero. 19th century Adventist camp meetings normally lasted 1 to even 2 weeks, and they featured enthusiastic but very long 2-hour sermons, exuberant but not always harmonious singing, emotional and very short personal testimonies, 1 minute per person, exciting mission stories from exotic places, and often, as we will see this morning, scores of baptisms at camp meetings. It required much muscle and sweat to prepare the grounds, pitch the tents, cook the food over open fires, feed the horse teams, spread tons of straw, organize the services, and police the campsite. At old-fashioned Adventist camp meetings, one heard bells ringing, children shouting, believers singing, and horses nickering in their stalls. One smelled hot canvas, wet straw and hay, fresh manure, and nutritious but not always delicious meals in the food tent, particularly if John Harvey Kellogg was in charge. Depending on the location and the time of year, one felt blistering sun, chilling winds, driving rain, or pounding hail. Looking around, one could see bearded, gray-haired ministers in black, 3-piece wool suits. Women wearing snow-white blouses and dark ankle-length dresses. Little boys in knickers, little girls in skirts and wearing hats. Camp meeting was a time for joyful reunions, tearful confessions, generous giving, and heartfelt commitments. In an era when paid vacations were unknown in America, Adventists joyfully took time off from their work to attend what Elder J.N. Loughborough frequently called Feasts of Tabernacles. He took that term from the Hebrew celebration, Feasts of Tabernacles. Now, one fact to keep in mind about 19th century Adventist camp meetings is that they were both revivals, that is, intended to revive the faith of Adventist members, and they were evangelistic, in other words, intended to convert the public. So consequently, instead of creating one central campground, as you now have in Cicero, the pioneers moved their big tent almost every summer to a different location around the state. For example, camp meetings, as you see by this list, were held at Tipton in 1870, Fairfield in 71, Kokomo 72, Rails Grove 73 and 4, Bunker Hill 75, Peru 76, Kokomo again in 77 and 8, and then in 1879 in Rochester for the people living in the northern part of the state, and Noblesville for the Adventists living in the central part of the state. So every year, camp meeting moved around. Well, let's take a closer look at some of the features of these 1870s camp meetings. In 1870, that's 2 years before the Indiana Conference was organized, the first camp meeting in the state convened at Tipton, that's fairly close to Kokomo, because there was easy access by way of the Peru and Indianapolis Railroad. Most Adventists came by railroad to camp meetings. You don't do that anymore. James and Ellen White, W.H. Littlejohn, and several preachers from the Ohio Conference spoke at this rather short, it was only about 5 days, October 6 to 10, convocation. Workers pitched one large tent for general meetings, 5 smaller tents for the church groups, and they urged the individuals to secure for themselves old Civil War Army pup tents. Now, I'm sure Jeff Landis wondered, what did the Army do at the end of the Civil War with those pup tents? Well, they sold many of them to Adventists for camp meetings around the United States. That's what happened to the Civil War tents. Attendees were urged to bring their wood stoves with them, to bring food with them, but not flesh food or poultry, and to bring their unconverted children and friends. The more the better, Elder E.B. Lane suggested. Now, James White, writing in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, stated that this first gathering left non-Adventist attendees favorably and deeply impressed, especially with the good order that prevailed. You see, a little side note here, Methodist, Baptist, Disciples of Christ camp meetings were often rowdy affairs. And many gentlemen didn't feel comfortable bringing their wives and children to those camp meetings. So what typically happened is a gentleman would come to one meeting at an Adventist camp meeting and notice how orderly and quiet it was. And then in the next meeting, he'd bring his wife and children. The police who volunteered to watch over the Adventist camp meetings soon left after the second day because there was nothing for them to do. Adventist camp meetings were so orderly, well organized, and quiet. The non-Adventists also bought many Adventist books. One Quaker and another Methodist woman told Mrs. White, no religious influence had ever made so deep an impression on the people of Tipton as this Adventist camp meeting has. Knowing that many of the men opposed women speaking in public, these ladies volunteered to pray for Ellen White as she preached. Now, these are non-Adventist women praying for Ellen White. Following the service, many Christians invited Mrs. White to speak in their churches. Isn't that wonderful? Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Disciples of Christ. Albert Lane also noted that these meetings had the effect of uniting the hearts of believers, bringing perfect union and harmony among Adventists across the state. Now, the second camp meeting was held in Greason's Grove, 3 miles west of Fairfield, 5 miles south of Kokomo, on the Peru and Indianapolis Railroad, which I'm sure no longer exists. It was short, 5 days, September 21 to 26. Now, this time, the conference did provide horse teams to convey attendees and their baggage from the train station to the campground. In addition, the large tent, which was borrowed that year from Michigan, campers could dine at the provision tent and purchase their hay and grain for their horses at the food store on the grounds. Speakers included James and Ellen White, W.H. Littlejohn, John Wagner, and J.N. Andrews. William Covert urged believers to come and enjoy a rare feast of good things. And they certainly did. Over 200 Adventists came to this camp meeting. They came from North Liberty, LaPorte, Sulphur Springs, and Kokomo, as well as from Owen, Clay, and Monroe counties. And they brought with them straw ticks, quilts, and cloth tents. Adventists frequently used cloth tents until they were caught in the first Indiana rainstorm. And then they learned a lesson. Cloth doesn't stop the rain. You need canvas instead. They purchased a wide variety of fresh fruits and vegetables at the food tent. Many of them stayed in the 12 cabins that were built especially for that particular camp meeting. And then on Sunday, nearly 2,000 local citizens crowded into the grounds. Now you have to realize Kokomo only had 4,000 inhabitants at this time. So basically half the town of Kokomo came to the Adventist camp meeting. 20 came forward for prayers, and Elder Lane baptized 17 of them in a stream 5 miles from the campgrounds. A generous offering was given, $400. That would be equivalent to $10,000 today, for the Western Health Reform Institute and the Review and Herald Publishing Association. During his closing prayer, Elder Littlejohn begged God to preserve Hoosier Adventists from the love of controversy, which has characterized some of the sects in Indiana. Now, from August 19 to 24, 1872, believers gathered at another grove 8 miles west of Kokomo, near the Burlington and Kokomo Pike Road. The three-man planning committee, W.R. Carpenter, Charles Seward, William Covert, urged them to bring their families and their friends and their neighbors, as well as their hearts full of love and souls full of energy. This time, all the tents were organized in a beautiful, large circle, with each church tent's name printed on white muslin signs bordered with fresh green leaves attached to the front of the tent. So they didn't have private tents, they had church tents. There would be an Anderson church tent, all right, with all of you staying in the same tent. Women on one end with a canvas partition, men on the other end. That's how they used to do it. So popular was the Kokomo area for gatherings that from September 18 to 22, 1873, believers took the New London and Kokomo Dirt Road to Rails Grove. That's about 4.5 miles west of Kokomo. This particular camp meeting also marked the first session of the newly organized Indiana Conference. And throughout the 19th century, conference business sessions would meet concurrently with the annual camp meeting. We don't do that anymore, but that's the way it was in the 19th century. General Conference President George I. Butler, who preached at the large tent, reported this was the largest gathering of Adventists in the state of Indiana, filling 16 family tents. Attendees gave $1,000 for Battle Creek College, $160 for the Indiana Tract and Missionary Society, $250 for the General Conference Fund. Now remember, you have to multiply each of those figures by 25. That's a lot of money, a lot of money. One United Brethren man was converted, and a Presbyterian Sunday school teacher who had walked several miles to the Adventist camp meeting accepted the three angels' message and closed his lumber yard on Sabbath. On the negative side, however, Elder Butler noted that the debating spirit was much too strong here in Indiana, and he hoped that the next year a nearby farmer's hogs might be kept away at a distance from the big tent by fencing them off. The hogs smelled terrible, and they were noisy during camp meeting. Imagine having to put up with that in Cicero today. With the 1873 camp meeting convened at Rails Grove from September 24 to 29, those porkers had been penned up, which was a good thing, since the top brass, we're talking about James and Ellen White, Elder Stephen Haskell and his wife Mary, Albert Lane and his wife Ellen, were also attending these meetings. This time, 200 Adventists pitched 22 tents in a large circle. And on Sunday, over 1,500 non-Adventist local citizens came to the meetings. Attendees gave $200 to the Systematic Benevolence Fund, $500 to the brand new Pacific Press on the West Coast, $500 for the bookwork, another $200 for the General Conference. Half the people present came forward for prayers on the last day. 16 were baptized. Nearby Wildcat Creek Well, tears trickled down the faces of many who were watching on the riverbank. You know, non-Adventists typically showed up in droves for our baptisms. That was something novel to them. Baptism by immersion, because obviously they had been sprinkled. During a social meeting, what we would call a testimony meeting, nearly all of the 1,500 individuals gave short testimonies, many with tears in their eyes. In those days, personal testimonies didn't last more than 1 minute. So you could get, 100 testimonies in 1 hour from those attending. In 1875, citizens from coast to coast began celebrating the shot heard round the world 100 years earlier at Bunker Hill, Massachusetts, that had precipitated the American Revolution. And no doubt with patriotic fever in mind, conference leaders chose to hold the fall camp meeting that year at Bunker Hill, Indiana. Bunker Hill, Massachusetts, where the war began, Bunker Hill, Indiana. And here we have Elm Street, near where the camp meeting was held. For the first time, Adventists who boarded the trains at 10 railroad stations on the Indianapolis, Peru, and Chicago Railroad received reduced excursion tickets to attend this camp meeting. That practice would become standard fare throughout the state of Indiana, and indeed across the United States thereafter. From October 7 to 12, the camp meeting speakers included James and Ellen White, Dudley M. Kenwright, and Uriah Smith. As I mentioned last time, he very seldom left his office as editor of the Review, but he seemed to like to come down here to Indiana, as well as Sands Lane and H.M. Kenyon. Facing freezing rain and morning ice on their wash bowls, 200 Adventists, shivering in 21 tents, lit their wood stoves to keep warm at camp meeting. After Kenwright had preached a 2-hour sermon on the pillars of our faith, 10 listeners stood up to signify their desire to keep the Sabbath. Once he had broken the ice on the nearby river, Elder Kenyon baptized 23 converts. Despite chattering teeth, union and harmony prevailed throughout the gathering, Uriah Smith declared. After freezing to death at this 1875 camp meeting, the conference leaders moved the dates up a whole month to September 14 through 18, 1876, hoping for warmer weather when the meetings began, this time on the Peru Fairgrounds. Adventists were instructed to take the Toledo and Wabash Railroad or the Indianapolis, Peru, and Chicago Railroad. Either way, they could travel for half fare in this centennial year. Preachers included James and Ellen White, Dudley M. Kenwright, as well as Hoosier ministers William Harvey, W.W. Sharp, and William Covert. Since the fairgrounds boasted 6 large empty buildings beneath its large spreading oak trees, fewer Adventists had to pitch tents that year. Following the Whites' preaching, 50 sinners and backsliders and lukewarm people, as the Review described them, came forward for prayers. And for half an hour, many of them wept and praised God. And then on Sunday, hundreds of local believers attended to see Harvey, Sharp, and Covert ordained to the gospel ministry and witness the immersion of 20 new converts. Yet so many of the saints longed for the delightfully shaded beach groves of Kokomo that in 1877 the camp meeting returned there from August 9 to 14. In a beautiful grove 1 mile from the courthouse, on a lot provided free of charge, by the way, by the civic authorities, Adventists convened. They arrived on one of 4 railroads that bisected this village of 4,000 inhabitants. The Indianapolis Railroad, the Peru and Chicago Railroad, the Panhandle Railroad, or the Frankfort and Kokomo Railroad. Now, each congregation was urged to buy its own tent for its own attendees, rather than to rent one that year. But all were assured there would be ample provision for man and beast. Now this time, 300 Adventists, notice the numbers are steadily rising, 100, then 200, now 300. 26 church and family tents completed the circle. 2 local newspaper editors, by the way, promised to cover all the meetings with complete coverage of the sermons. The Kokomo Dispatch was one. Once again, Ellen White, J.H. Wagner, Sands Lane did most of the preaching. Mrs. White was delighted with these natural settings, by the way. She gives a colorful description of the campground that year. She said, "We met under a canopied, interlaced branches that formed a natural roof of leaves so dense that during a slight shower, scarcely a drop of rain sifted through." However, a heavier rainstorm on Sabbath broke up the meeting when Elder Lane was preaching. Ellen praised her Hoosier listeners. You want to know what Ellen White thought of you folks down here in Indiana? Here's a one-sentence quote. "We have not met at any of our camp meetings a more intelligent, earnest, and truth-loving people than in Indiana. Many of them are persons of education and influence." High words from the Lord's messenger for Indiana Adventists. After her temperance lecture, and by the way, 8,000 non-Adventists attended her temperance lecture. That's double the population of Kokomo. She asked those who had given up tobacco to stand to their feet, and nearly 40 did so. 12 of them were women. Dr. Hill and his wife, he's the local WCTU leader, converted to Adventism at that camp meeting. Ellen especially enjoyed social meetings where brief testimonies full of life and cheerful hope and edifying to all who heard them were shared. After 50 sinners and backsliders came forward for prayers, 15 were baptized, including Dr. Hill and his wife and their mute daughter. And A.W. Bartlett was ordained to the gospel ministry by Elders Wagner and Lane. "This meeting," Ellen White wrote in the review, "was one of the best of its kind I ever attended." From August 14 to 19, 1878, Adventists returned to the campground near Kokomo with its shady grove and nearby stream for baptizing converts. Those seem to be two requirements for 19th century Adventist camp meetings. You want a shady grove, and you want a nearby stream, lake, river, so you can baptize people. Two requirements. Since the Michigan camp meeting followed immediately after the Indiana one, Hoosiers could not rent their tents this time. Instead, President Lane advised them either to get the materials from Elder J.M. Rees in Kokomo and make their own tents, or buy them from William Armstrong's factory in Chicago. Hoping to provide a new impetus to missionary work in the state, conference officials invited Elders Haskell and C.W. Stone to encourage members to become literature evangelists. So here's the first time, 1878, the literature evangelism work is pushed in Indiana. Lane urged believers to become burning lights in a well-trained army of colporteurs blanketing the state. Hundreds of Hoosiers who boarded the Indianapolis, Peru, and Chicago Railroad at any of 14 different stations received half-price tickets to attend that camp meeting of 1878. Half price. Those who traveled on the Frankfort and Kokomo Railroad got an even better deal. They got what the railroad company called the Camp Meeting Special. Round trip, $1.50. That makes it worth going to camp meeting, doesn't it? $1.50. As the number of Adventists grew exponentially across Indiana by the end of the decade, conference leaders decided in 1879 the time had come to have 2 camp meetings instead of just 1. They put one in Rochester for those that were living in the northern part of the state. They put another in Noblesville for those that were dwelling near the center of the state. The Noblesville camp meeting, held in a beautiful grove, convened first, August 5 to 11. 250 attendees. Paid half fare on the Indianapolis, Peru, and Chicago Railroad, or some of them came on the Anderson, Lebanon, and St. Louis Railroad. They rented 24 tents that year. $3 to $4 to rent a tent for a whole week. Elder D.M. Kenwright and Elder W.C. White did most of the preaching, and Willie White presided over the Indiana Tract and Missionary Society meeting, as well as over the very first Sabbath School Convention held in Indiana. A report published in the Review by Elder J.P. Henderson stated, "The Spirit of the Lord was present during all of our meetings. Attendees purchased $72 of books, subscribed to 74 magazines, bought $30 worth of health food at the provision tent. At the close of the meeting, Elders Covert and J.M. Rees baptized 34 converts by the railroad bridge in the nearby White River. There was a solemn service, and lining the banks were between 3,000 and 4,000 local non-Adventists. You get that when you have a baptism? 3,000, 4,000 citizens of Anderson show up. That was what it was like. 19th century Adventist camp meeting baptisms. Almost 2 months later, a camp meeting was held in Rochester, September 30 to October 6, 1879. James and Ellen White were the main speakers there. This proved to be a particularly important convocation because both the Indiana Health and Temperance Society and the Indiana Sabbath School Association were organized in Rochester on October 5. And the first one, the Health and Temperance Society, had 139 members. You remember I've been telling you in the past presentations how the Hoosier Adventists were struggling with the issue of health reform. Giving up that pork, that bacon. Yeah. 19 churches sent 21 delegates to form the Sabbath School Association. They elected J.M. Rees as president and Viola Schrock as secretary. They also passed several resolutions calling for all Adventists in Indiana to attend their local Sabbath school classes, to give regular penny offerings, to keep their record books up to date, to gather together for district Sabbath school institutes whenever possible. Unfortunately, this gathering was marred somewhat by Elder A.W. Bartlett's preaching of some peculiar views. I won't go into detail on them. He had some peculiar views on sanctification and perfectionism. He had been promoting those for the last 2 years here in Indiana. And in a very blunt testimony, Ellen White, you can read her testimony, she warned him that this was fanaticism, it was inspired by Satan, and that he was going to draw away precious souls from the truth. And happily, Elder Bartlett confessed his wrong course. He promised to work hard to build unity across the conference, and he did just that. But sadly, the seeds that Elder Bartlett had already planted in the 1870s would bear some bitter fruit 2 decades later when the Holy Flesh movement, I'm sure you've heard of that, arose in Evansville in 1898 and Muncie in 1899. When we get to our chapter on the 1890s, I'll go into a little more detail on the Holy Flesh movement, bring you up to date on that. By the end of the decade, however, at least 36 Adventists could no longer fellowship with their Sabbath school friends because they had passed away between 1870 and 79. Naturally, as the number of converts to Adventism mushroomed in the 1870s, the number of those who died also increased. Whereas in the 1850s, you remember, we find in the records only 4 Adventist deaths. 1860s, that tripled to 12. 1870s, it tripled again, 38 deaths. I will share the names with you in hopes that maybe somebody here will recognize an early Adventist ancestor. That's the exciting part. Oh, yes, that was my great-great-aunt, my great-great-grandfather. All right? I hope somebody does. Perhaps the most tragic losses occurred among those infants whose lives were ended almost before they began. Josephine Lane, that's the daughter of Elder Albert and Ellen Lane of Spencer, Indiana, died of dysentery at 2 in 1870. Ada McGuire of Huntington, felled by tuberculosis at 5 months, 1871. Matilda Bringle of Sharpsville, killed by cholera at 17 months, 1877. Olive Harmon of Noblesville passed away at 2 years, 1879, of an unknown disease. And then there were the teenagers and the young adults who were cut down in the prime of their lives. Silas Carpenter of North Liberty died at 16, 1871. John Wheat of Spencer perished at 16, 1872. Anna, 18. Robert, 21. Elizabeth, 23. Beatty, all of the same family. Patricksburg, all of them caught the measles and the lung disease, and they died within weeks of one another. Over in Marion, Callie Fadley succumbed to typhoid fever at 19, 1876. The following year, Della Baxter, 21, of Bunker Hill. Lucy Johnson, 17, of Bourbon, passed away of unknown causes, as did Emma Easterling of New London at the age of 19, 1879. Aren't you thankful for modern medicine? It's giving you longer lives, folks. Longer lives. Others more fortunate managed to live to middle age before they perished. Lucy Spencer of Hobart, 34, of typhoid pneumonia, 1870. Sister Coy of Howard County, 37, of typhoid. Sarah Stiles, 39, of North Liberty. Rebecca McCulley, 34, Patricksburg. Tuberculosis, 1873. Margaret Covert, 32. She was the wife of Elder William Covert. He's a future Indiana Conference president, by the way. He lived in Sharpsville. Elizabeth Harvey, 48, of North Liberty, 1873. Her friend Jacob Stiles, 36, of North Liberty. Mrs. Oberholzer, now she's the wife of the only Indiana evangelist who can speak German fluently, Elder D.H. Oberholzer. Good German name. She died at 32 in 1874. 3 months later, George Shortridge, 51, of Honey Creek. Deborah Goodrich, 32, of Rochester. In 1875, TB took the lives of Sister Ellen Baxter, 27, of Bunker Hill. Amanda Worcester, 33, of North Liberty. But it was malaria that felled Ezra Wilkinson, 32, of Richmond, and perhaps Jane Wolfe, 43, in Liberty the next year. As the decade ended, David Randolph, 58, perished in Patricksburg. David Ulrich, 48, of Noblesville, died from hemorrhaging of the lungs in 1879. Have you noticed the pattern? A lot of the deaths are caused by lung disease. Tuberculosis, diphtheria, pneumonia, bleeding lungs. We've conquered those problems, right? We've conquered those problems with the vaccinations and shots and medications. And yet there were a handful of saints who, having weathered wind and storm for decades, like the Cedars of Lebanon, passed to the rest at ages considerably far advanced, at least according to the 19th century, when the average lifespan ended in the late 40s. The obituary for Daniel Carpenter of North Liberty stated he died of old age at 85 in 1870. P.S. Cottrell of Daleville, that's close to you, Jesse, Daleville, succumbed to typhoid fever, 1872, at the age of 72. As did Perrin Scarborough, 88, of Clinton, in 1874. That same year, Catherine Bachtel of North Liberty passed away at 61, as did Lydia Locke of Salem Center at 74. As the decade closed, Henry May of Ligonier died from TB at 67. The aged patriarch Jacob Carr of Wolf Lake outlived them all. He died at the incredibly advanced age of 94 in 1879, which means that Jacob had been born in 1785. That's 4 years before George Washington was sworn in as our first president of the United States. 94. Reading the obituaries for many of these 38 saints can be a rather emotional experience. Well, time will not permit us to read them all. I'd like to share a select few with you to give you a flavor of how our pioneers faced death. O.H. Spencer said of his wife Lucy, she rejoiced in the hope of having a part in the first resurrection. Following the funeral of their darling 2-year-old daughter Josephine, Elder Elbert and Ellen Lane resolved to patiently and cheerfully toil and labor on till our work is faithfully done, that we may meet our little one clad in immortal beauty in the bright morning of the resurrection. Uriah Smith wrote of Daniel Carpenter, 85, he came down to his grave well ripened for the heavenly garner. The parents of Ada McGuire, who died at 5 months, declared, "We lay our little Ada away without any fears of her future welfare." When a sudden illness claimed the life of sweet Lucy Johnson, age 17, her obituary stated she loved Jesus and is now safely resting. In 1878, when Garrett Cruzan succumbed to heart disease, the review testified that he died in the hope of a blessed immortality beyond the grave. Likewise, Henry May, who died of TB the next year, had stood firmly for the truth, died in the blessed hope. You know, it was also the custom in the 19th century among our Victorian ancestors to record the last words spoken by a dying family member. We don't do that anymore. When he died at only 16 in 1872, John Wheat expressed the belief that he should meet the Savior in the first resurrection. Elder Oberholzer's wife, who died in 1874 at only 32, expressed herself ready to go and meet Jesus as she drew her last breath. Equally heart-wrenching are the obituaries of young mothers and fathers who left behind children for their grieving spouses to rear. In 1872, Sarah Stiles, 39, died, leaving 7 children to mourn her passing. The following year, Margaret Covert, the wife of Elder William Covert, left 2 children. Jacob Stiles' early death at 36 left 5 children for his wife to rear. That same year, 1874, Deborah Goodrich's passing at 32 left 4 children for her husband. In 1875, Amanda Worcester, 33, left 2 children. When she passed away in 1877 at 43, however, Jane Wolfe entrusted to her grieving husband 10 children. Imagine the pain, the heartache. 10 children to raise. Barely 2 weeks before Della Baxter died in 1877, she lost her 6-month-old baby, leaving her husband to mourn both the loss of his wife and his only child. When David Randolph, 58, was buried in 1879, he left behind a wife and 6 children. But try to imagine the heartache of Anna Ulrich when her husband David died at 48 in 1879. Now, Anna had already lost 3 of her children to disease. And now she lost her husband, was alone in the world. Is it any wonder, my friends, that our Adventist pioneers yearned for the resurrection day? The second coming of Jesus was even more important to them because they saw death so frequently all around them. Well, let's sum up the 1870s here before we leave one another. The 1870s witnessed an explosion of Adventist activity across Indiana, thanks to the organization of the Indiana Conference, 1872, the formation of the Indiana Tract and Missionary Society, and local branches, which were called Vigilant Missionary Societies, 1873, the Indiana Health and Temperance Society of 79, the Sabbath School Association also in 79. Financially, the conference also benefited from the shift away from the 1859 Systematic Benevolence Plan. You remember we talked about that? We talked about that. That was where you paid 10% of your yearly increase from one year to the next. They switched to the tithing plan in 1878. That's where they gave 10% of their annual income. You can imagine there was a huge difference there for the conference treasury. Yeah. The impact of organization quickly became evident in several areas. First, the ministerial workforce doubled from 1 ordained evangelist and 3 licensed ones in 1872 to 4 ordained ministers and 5 licensed ones in 1879. We also find that aggressive evangelism throughout the state brought the 3 angels' messages to a whole bunch of new areas. Out-of-state evangelists such as Albert and Sands Lane and Joseph Wagner assisted a Hoosier ministerial team that was growing in numbers. And now they were holding tent meetings in dozens of little hamlets, villages, and towns around the state, finally entering the southeastern and southwestern corners of Indiana by 1879. And yet, as the frontiers of Adventism advanced, the forces of opposition grew stronger and more determined. And what we have seen during the 1870s is that ministers belonging to the Disciples of Christ, the Methodists, the United Brethren, the Presbyterian, the Lutheran churches, proved particularly hostile, and they brought in debaters to debate with Adventists about the seventh-day Sabbath, the state of the dead, and the perpetuity of God's law. Paid professional debaters often showed up. But you know what? The pattern is solid. Every time the debaters agreed to abide by the Bible, the Adventists won. Because the congregation voted at the end of the week or 2-week debates. The Adventists always won the debates. Occasionally, the evangelists were also hampered by ruffians, by secret slander campaigns, by attacks of disease and illness, and by bad weather too. And yet new Adventist congregations were established all across the conference, and we've seen that list, dozens of them. Sabbath schools and quarterly meetings, what we today call communion service, were also being held at 31 different church centers around the state by 1879. And one of the reasons for the rapid increase was colporteurs, right? For the first time, we have literature evangelists going out with Adventist literature around the state. And the top ones, as we saw, were the Lane brothers, Sands and Albert Lane. They get the blue ribbon for the top book salesman of the conference. But there were others throughout the state, many of them married couples, spreading Adventist publications like the Leaves of Autumn. And when the Tract and Missionary Society was organized in 1872, then we have scores of laymen and laywomen also going out with hundreds of pages of tracts and pamphlets and books and writing missionary letters. That helps greatly. And once the literature work expanded rapidly, the cause of health reform began to pick up a little bit. Now that lagged a little bit behind. I know you've noticed that pattern. The Hoosiers are reluctant to give up their pork, their chewing tobacco and meats and tea and coffee and so forth. But by the end of the 1870s, we find more health reform penetrating Adventist ranks down here. And there were some congregations that really went whole, I was going to say whole hog, but that's not a good expression. They went wholeheartedly for health reform in the 1870s. Mechanicsburg, Bunker Hill, Deedsville, Marion, Yorktown, Alexandria, Noblesville, those were leading churches with health reform. And once copies of the Good Health magazine, that had been the old health reformer paper renamed Good Health, began to be distributed in the late 1870s, why health reform really got a shot in the arm there. Another effective proselyting method we've seen was camp meetings. Camp meetings are occasions for evangelism at this time in history, and that's why they move them around every year. The Feast of Tabernacles, as they call them. And if Adventists attended camp meetings by the hundreds, non-Adventists came by the thousands, particularly on Sundays. Sundays were devoted to informing non-Adventists what the main doctrines of our church were. We have also seen that the plans created by men and women could often be thwarted by Mother Nature. Indiana is just famous for rain, right? Aren't we getting it today? Rain. Jesse tells me 5 inches of rain yesterday. 1870, 76, 77, 79. Heavy blizzards in 72 often interrupted Adventist meetings, made it difficult for individuals to attend. Frequent complaints I've shared with you about the knee-deep mud on Indiana's road. Aren't you happy for paved roads? Some of you are old enough to remember when some of these county roads weren't paved at all. Yeah. And what people had to do was leave the road and hike through the fields to get to the Adventist meetings. Epidemics also hit many of them. And yet, as their obituaries show, many of the 38 Adventist pioneers who died in the 1870s perished from diseases that we have conquered today. Aren't you thankful for that? Modern medicine, vaccines, tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhoid, measles, dysentery, malaria, cholera. They were the chief killers 150 years ago. We've conquered all of those diseases, all of them. Others are easily preventable by hygienic living conditions, vaccinations, and other medical procedures. But in the 19th century, these diseases spared neither male nor female, young nor old, male nor female, black nor white. They just killed indiscriminately. And yet, as we have seen, these Hoosier saints went to their graves absolutely certain that they would soon rise again on the resurrection day to meet their Lord in the air. Do we have that hope today? Is it solid in our hearts that we will rise again and see our Lord in the air?